As we drove down the highway, the sign for Silver Lake Park flashed by. I couldn't help but feel a mixture of excitement and unease bubbling inside me. "There it is! We're almost there!" Georgia practically squealed from the passenger seat, already collecting her things and stuffing them back into her backpack. Her enthusiasm had been palpable since the moment we started planning this camping trip, something she had been pushing for months. Despite her constant pleas and how much she hyped it up, it had taken quite a bit of convincing to get all of us on board. Georgia was always the outdoorsy one in our group. Growing up in the countryside had given her a deep love for nature. She often talked about camping trips, hiking adventures, and swimming in lakes with her family. Moving to the city for school, however, meant she didn't have as much time for her beloved outdoor activities. This trip, she hoped, would reignite that passion. As for me, I had gone camping a few times when I was younger, mostly with my dad and brother. I remembered liking it well enough, but it had been years since I'd slept in a tent or roasted marshmallows by a campfire. Haley and Mel, the other two girls in our group, were excited but somewhat hesitant. They'd never been camping before, but figured it would be fun to try something new. Then there was Laura. Laura was, without question, the least interested in this trip. She was the quintessential city girl, high maintenance, detesting anything that involved dirt, bugs, or sleeping without access to a shower. She made it abundantly clear that she hated the idea of sleeping in a tent, but in a rare show of friendship, she agreed to come. She knew how much it meant to Georgia, and despite her dramatic protests, Laura was a good friend. The drive to the park was about 2 hours from the city. Since I was the only one with a car, the driving responsibility naturally fell to me. Georgia rode shotgun, bubbling with excitement the whole time, yammering on about all the things she had planned for our weekend: hiking, campfires, swimming, and exploring the trails. Every now and then I would catch the eye of Haley or Mel in the rearview mirror, and we'd exchange small, amused smiles at Georgia's endless enthusiasm. Laura, on the other hand, was quiet for most of the ride, staring out the window, probably mentally preparing herself for what she considered a nightmare weekend. Finally, we turned into the small parking lot at Silver Lake Park. We were all stiff from the drive, so getting out of the car felt like heaven. We stretched our legs, grabbed our backpacks and camping gear, and prepared for the hike to our campsite. We had booked a spot at Pine Flats, one of the 5 campsites in the area. According to the map, it was about a 30-minute hike from the parking lot. I volunteered to help Georgia carry the large 6-person tent, while Mel handled the cooking supplies. Haley carried the cooler, and Laura begrudgingly grabbed the bag of food. We double-checked that we had everything, locked the car, and started our journey into the woods. The trail was narrow, so we had to walk in single file. Naturally, Georgia led the way, her backpack bouncing as she happily trudged ahead. I followed close behind, then Mel, Haley, and finally Laura bringing up the rear. We chatted as we walked, and Georgia continued her enthusiastic commentary about the various plants and trees we passed, clearly in her element. About 20 minutes into the hike, I started hearing some mumbling from the back of the line. Laura had slowed down, and I could hear her muttering complaints under her breath. I glanced back and saw her limping slightly. "Everything okay back there, Laura?" Haley asked, turning to check on her. "My feet are killing me," Laura grumbled. "I think a blister popped. It hurts like hell." "We're almost there," Haley said sympathetically. "Just a little bit longer." Laura nodded, but her face was tight with irritation. It was barely noon, and the heat was already oppressive. The trees provided some shade, but the air was thick with humidity, and sweat dripped down the back of my neck. Georgia, sensing that we were all feeling the effects of the heat, called back, "There's a lake right next to our campsite. We can go swimming as soon as we get there." That was all the motivation we needed. We picked up the pace, eager to get to the water and cool off. As we crossed a small wooden bridge over a pond, I heard rustling behind me. I turned just in time to see Laura climbing down the embankment toward the water. "Laura, what are you doing?" I called out, stopping in my tracks. "My feet are on fire, and this stupid blister popped. It's bleeding, and it hurts like a bitch," she yelled back. "I'm just going to rinse them in the pond real quick to cool them off." Before I could respond, Georgia had already pushed past me and was making her way down the bank. "Laura, I wouldn't do that. Stagnant pond water can be pretty gross. There could be bacteria in there," Georgia warned. "We're really close to the campsite. Just wait a few more minutes and we can swim in the lake instead." "I'll be fine. This water looks clear, see?" Laura shot back, dipping her toes into the pond. From where I was standing, I could see that she was right. The water did look surprisingly clear, though there was a strange orange tint to it. You guys keep going, Laura said, waving us off. I'll catch up. Georgia hesitated, glancing back at me. I don't like this, she muttered under her breath. Let's just give her a minute, I replied. She'll be fine. Reluctantly, Georgia and I rejoined the others, and we continued our hike to the campsite. A few minutes later, we arrived at Pine Flats and set to work setting up camp. Georgia and I struggled with the tent, while Haley and Mel organized the cooking supplies and cooler. Laura eventually wandered into the campsite, looking a bit more at ease after soaking her feet. The rest of the afternoon was actually really fun. We changed into our swimsuits and spent hours swimming in the lake and sunbathing on the little sandy beach nearby. The cool water was refreshing after the hot, sticky hike, and for the first time since we arrived, even Laura seemed to be enjoying herself. As the sun started to set, we built a fire and prepared dinner, hot dogs and corn on the cob. The mood was light as we passed around food and drinks, chatting about what we wanted to do the next day. But as the evening wore on, I noticed that Laura had grown unusually quiet. She was staring blankly into the fire, her face expressionless. Hey Laura, you okay? Mel asked, breaking the silence. Yeah, I'm fine, Laura replied lazily, her eyes still fixed on the flames. I'm just really tired. You sure? You look a little pale, Georgia added. Laura gave a small nod but didn't say anything else. We all exchanged concerned glances, but no one pressed her further. Laura had a tendency to get cranky when she was tired, so we figured she just needed some sleep. A couple of hours later, we decided to go for a night swim at the lake. We asked Laura if she wanted to join us, but she shook her head. No, I'm going to go to bed, she said flatly. When she stood up, I couldn't help but notice how pale she looked. Her skin was almost grey, and her eyes had a strange intensity to them. I chalked it up to exhaustion and the long day in the sun, but something about her appearance made me uneasy. Are you sure you're okay? I asked cautiously. Yes, Sophia, I'm fine, Laura snapped, her eyes narrowing. I'm just tired, okay? Taken aback by her tone, I nodded quickly. Okay, we'll be at the lake if you need anything. Without another word, Laura turned and walked toward the tent, leaving the rest of us standing by the fire in awkward silence. We exchanged concerned looks but decided to let her be. Laura could be a bit dramatic at times, but we all figured she was just overtired and grumpy from the long day. The night swim was relaxing. The water was cool and calming, and we floated lazily for about an hour, talking and laughing under the moonlight. Eventually, we made our way back to camp, exhausted but in good spirits. The tent was quiet, and Laura seemed to be sound asleep on the far side, facing the wall. We tiptoed around as we got into our sleeping bags, careful not to wake her. It wasn't long before I drifted off to sleep, but at some point during the night, I was jolted awake by a noise. It was faint, but it sounded like a grunt or a yell, something that pulled me out of my dream. I sat up on my elbows, squinting in the darkness, trying to adjust my eyes. The tent was pitch black, but I could make out the shapes of Georgia, Mel, and myself in the dim light. However, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Laura and Haley were gone. I figured they must have gone to the bathroom together. It was common for us to pair up when going into the woods at night. Still, a strange feeling of unease crept up my spine. Something about the darkness felt too still, too silent, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I lay back down, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe one of them had tripped, or they were just taking their time. I closed my eyes, willing myself to fall back asleep. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It gnawed at me, making my heart race for no apparent reason. Several minutes later, I heard the familiar sound of the tent unzipping and a single set of footsteps returning. I glanced over, watching as a figure quietly climbed back into their sleeping bag, but only one. I waited for a few more minutes, expecting Haley or Laura to return, but no one else came. A heavy sense of dread settled in my chest. Should I say something? Should I ask who had come back? My mind was racing with possibilities, but I forced myself to stay calm. I told myself that whoever hadn't returned was probably still using the bathroom and would be back soon. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I settled back into my sleeping bag, trying to push the anxiety away, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. A little while later, I was startled awake again, this time by a soft touch on my arm. I jolted upright, my heart pounding, but it was only Georgia, crouched beside me. I need to go to the bathroom. Can you come with me? She whispered, her voice trembling slightly. I rubbed my eyes, still groggy from sleep, and nodded. I realized that I needed to go too, so I grabbed my jacket and flashlight from my pack and tiptoed out of the tent with her. As we made our way into the trees, I couldn't help but glance back toward the tent. A sense of unease washed over me again. Something about that missing set of footsteps still lingered in my mind, but I pushed the thought away. The night was eerily quiet as we walked deeper into the woods. The only sound was the crunching of leaves and twigs beneath our feet. The darkness was so thick that our flashlights felt like weak beams cutting through an endless void. Without the comfort of streetlights or the glow of the moon, the forest seemed to close in around us, swallowing everything in its path. I stayed close to Georgia, shining my flashlight ahead of us as we approached the old outhouse. "You can go first," I said, stepping aside to give her privacy. Georgia nodded and hurried inside, closing the door behind her with a soft creak. I stepped away, moving down the small hill that led away from the outhouse, letting her have her space. Standing there, alone in the dark, I suddenly became hyper-aware of my surroundings. The trees loomed tall and menacing around me, their branches casting long, twisted shadows. The forest was deathly silent, too silent. I shone my flashlight around, casting its narrow beam through the trees. The light illuminated nothing but more darkness, more emptiness. But something about the stillness, the oppressive quiet, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It felt like I was being watched. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was just letting my imagination run wild, but the feeling was so intense that I couldn't ignore it. My pulse quickened, and I started to sweat. My eyes darted from tree to tree, scanning the dense woods for any sign of movement, but there was nothing, just endless black. I was about to call out to Georgia to tell her to hurry up when my flashlight caught something on the ground. I froze. There, in the dirt, was a thick, dark liquid, something that gleamed faintly in the beam of my flashlight. Blood. My breath hitched in my throat. I stared at the crimson trail, my mind reeling. What could have caused this? An animal, but it didn't look like an animal injury. The blood was thick, pooling in some places and trailing from the direction of the outhouse. I took a cautious step closer, shining my flashlight up the small hill. The trail of blood led behind the outhouse. "Georgia!" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response. "Georgia!" I took another step forward, my flashlight shaking in my hand. My heart was pounding in my ears as I approached the outhouse. The blood seemed to grow thicker as I neared the source. I felt a sickening sense of dread building inside me. Suddenly the door to the outhouse swung open, and Georgia stepped out. I almost screamed, jumping back in surprise. "Geez, can't a girl pee in peace?" she joked, oblivious to the terror that had gripped me. She started to walk down the hill, but she stopped when she saw the look on my face. "What's wrong?" "Georgia, there's blood," I stammered, pointing to the ground. Her eyes followed my flashlight beam, and when she saw the thick trail of red, her smile vanished. "Is that blood?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded, my throat dry. "It's coming from behind the outhouse." Georgia's eyes widened with fear, but I could see the determination on her face. "We need to see where it's coming from." I didn't want to. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't leave without knowing. Together, we slowly crept around the side of the outhouse, following the trail of blood. What we found made my heart stop. Haley was lying face down in a pool of blood, her blonde hair matted and stained with dirt and gore. A gaping wound at the back of her head oozed dark red, and beside her lay a large rock covered in blood and fragments of something I couldn't even begin to process. Georgia let out a strangled cry and stumbled backward, retching as she collapsed to her knees. I couldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from Haley's lifeless body, the gruesome scene before me freezing me in place. My stomach churned, and the urge to vomit rose in my throat, but I forced myself to swallow it back. I needed to stay in control, but all I could do was stare in shock. "Haley," I whispered, but the word barely left my lips. My hands shook violently as I fumbled for Georgia's arm, pulling her away from the horrific sight. "Georgia, we need to go back to camp, now." My voice cracked as I spoke. She didn't respond. She was too lost in shock, her eyes wide and unfocused. I could feel her trembling under my grip, her body shaking uncontrollably, but I pulled her up, and together we stumbled back toward the campsite, our feet moving clumsily over the uneven ground. When we finally broke through the trees and into the clearing where the fire pit and tent stood, I frantically scanned the area for any sign of Laura and Mel. The tent was open, and it was empty. I shone my flashlight into it, but there was no sign of them. Panic started to take hold. Where were they? What had happened while we were asleep? I guided Georgia to sit by the fire pit, her body trembling as she cradled her water bottle. I couldn't think straight. My mind was racing with questions, fear clawing at my insides. I felt completely helpless. How had everything gone so wrong so quickly? I spotted the ground around the tent, shoe prints and drag marks leading away from the campsite and toward the lake. 2 sets of prints, one steady and one erratic, as if someone had been dragging something or someone. My blood ran cold. I had to follow them. I had to know where Laura and Mel were. I couldn't just sit here and do nothing. But before I could decide what to do next, a loud splashing sound echoed from the direction of the lake. My heart leapt into my throat. Without thinking, I ran. I sprinted through the dark trees, my flashlight bobbing wildly as I made my way toward the water. Every step felt like it was taking forever, but eventually I reached the top of the hill that overlooked the lake. And there in the shallow water I saw them. Mel's body was floating just below the surface, her auburn hair fanned out in the water like a ghostly halo. And standing next to her, waist deep in the water, was Laura. She turned sharply as my flashlight illuminated the scene, her eyes locking onto mine. But this wasn't the Laura I knew. Her face was pale, almost grey, and her eyes glowed with a strange, unnatural light, reflecting back at me like an animal caught in headlights. "Laura, what have you done?" I whispered, my voice breaking. "What the hell is wrong with you?" She didn't respond. Instead, her mouth twisted into an ugly snarl, and before I could react, she lunged toward me, charging through the water like a wild animal. I turned and ran, my legs pumping as fast as they could carry me. I could hear her behind me, crashing through the water, her growls growing louder. I ran blindly through the trees, my only thought to get back to Georgia, to warn her, to get out of here before Laura could reach us. I burst into the clearing, gasping for breath. "Georgia, turn off your flashlight, we need to run," I shouted. "What? Where's Mel and Laura?" Georgia asked, panic rising in her voice. "Mel's gone," I whispered, my voice trembling. "It's Laura. Something's wrong with her. We have to go now." Georgia hesitated for a moment, her eyes wide with confusion and terror, but when she saw the panic on my face, she snapped into action. Without another word, she switched off her flashlight, grabbed my arm, and we bolted into the darkness, running as fast as we could away from the campsite and into the thick forest. The trees blurred past us as we sprinted, our breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind us, I could hear the violent crashing of branches and the unmistakable sound of Laura's heavy footsteps. Her growls echoed through the trees, sending waves of fear surging through my body. She wasn't far behind, and every second we wasted could be our last. "Which way is the car?" Georgia panted beside me, her voice shaking with fear. I don't know," I admitted. In the confusion and panic, I had lost my sense of direction. The trail markers were barely visible in the dark, and without our flashlights, we were relying on instinct and luck. I had no idea where we were going, and the deeper we ran into the forest, the more disoriented I felt. We pushed forward, desperately trying to put as much distance between us and Laura as possible, but the forest was like a maze, and every turn we made seemed to lead us further into the unknown. My lungs burned, my legs ached, and my mind raced with horrifying images of what Laura had done to Mel and Haley, and what she might do to us if she caught up. We ran for what felt like hours, the darkness pressing in around us, the only sound the pounding of our feet and the rustling of leaves in the underbrush. Finally, we stumbled upon a path, a real path, not just a deer trail. It was narrow, but it seemed like our best chance. "This way," I hissed, pulling Georgia along with me. We ran faster, our breaths ragged, our legs trembling from exhaustion. I kept my ears trained on the sounds behind us, trying to gauge how close Laura was. For a moment, the crashing and growling seemed to have stopped. Was she still following us? Had we lost her? We hit a fork in the trail, the paths branching off into 2 different directions. My heart sank. I had no idea which way to go. Georgia looked at me, tears in her eyes, her body trembling with fear and fatigue. I didn't know what to tell her. I was just as lost, just as terrified. I desperately scanned the trees for some kind of clue, a marker, anything to guide us. Just as I was about to make a guess, Georgia broke the silence, her voice barely a whisper. "This is all my fault, Sophia. I shouldn't have pushed us to come here. Haley and Mel are dead, and now Laura's. I dragged us out here and I—" "Stop it!" I cut her off, grabbing her shoulders and forcing her to meet my eyes. "This isn't your fault, Georgia. None of us knew this would happen." We're going to make it out of here. We just have to keep moving, okay? Georgia nodded shakily, though I could see the guilt weighing on her like a heavy chain. She sniffled, wiped her eyes, and we continued down the right-hand path, hoping it would lead us to the parking lot, to safety. Minutes passed, and the forest seemed to grow quieter. The crashing sounds from earlier had completely stopped. My heart still pounded in my chest, but with each step, the panic started to subside. Maybe Laura had given up. Maybe we had lost her in the maze of trees. But as we continued down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was too quiet. The forest should have been alive with the sounds of night creatures, owls, insects, the occasional rustling of small animals. But there was nothing, just silence, an unnatural, suffocating silence. And then, without warning, I heard a faint crack behind us. I froze. So did Georgia. We both turned slowly, our eyes scanning the dark, tangled woods behind us. At first I saw nothing, just the outlines of trees, the vague shapes of bushes and branches. But then, in the dim moonlight filtering through the canopy, I saw movement. A figure stepped out from behind a tree. Laura. But she didn't look like Laura anymore. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, with dark veins bulging along her neck and arms. Her eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light, and blood dripped from her nose and mouth. Her clothes were soaked with mud and blood, clinging to her thin, sickly frame. She stood there, swaying slightly, her chest rising and falling in ragged, unnatural breaths. She wasn't human anymore. "Laura," Georgia whispered, her voice breaking. But it wasn't our friend standing before us. It was something else, something twisted and monstrous, wearing Laura's face like a mask. For a moment, the three of us stood frozen, locked in a silent standoff. Then, without warning, Laura let out a guttural, animalistic snarl and charged at us, her eyes burning with fury. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing Georgia's hand and pulling her down the path. We sprinted as fast as we could, our feet pounding against the dirt, our hearts racing with terror. I could hear Laura behind us, crashing through the underbrush, her growls growing louder and more desperate. The trail wound through the trees, twisting and turning, but we didn't stop. We couldn't stop. My legs felt like lead, and my lungs burned with every breath, but I pushed through the pain, refusing to slow down. Georgia was struggling to keep up, her breaths coming in frantic gasps, but she didn't let go of my hand. Suddenly, up ahead, I saw something that made my heart leap. The parking lot. "We're almost there!" I shouted, adrenaline surging through my veins as we ran even faster. The edge of the forest was just ahead. We were going to make it. But as we broke through the tree line and stumbled into the parking lot, something terrible happened. Georgia let out a surprised scream, and I whipped around just in time to see her being yanked backward, out of my grasp. Laura had caught up to us. In an instant, Laura had pulled Georgia to the ground, pinning her down with terrifying strength. I watched in horror as Laura wrapped her hands around Georgia's throat, her fingers digging into her skin as she squeezed. "Georgia!" I cried, scrambling toward them, but it was too late. Laura's face twisted into a maniacal grin as she smashed Georgia's head into the pavement, once, twice, 3 times. The sickening sound of bone cracking echoed through the parking lot, and Georgia's body went limp. Blood pooled beneath her head, her once bright eyes now dull and lifeless. I staggered backward, my mind unable to process what I had just witnessed. Georgia was dead. My best friend was dead, and Laura... No, the thing that had once been Laura had killed her. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare at the horrifying scene in front of me, my mind blank with shock. And then Laura turned to face me. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a brief moment I saw something there, something that might have been recognition or regret, or even sorrow, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by the same feral hunger that had consumed her. She stood up slowly, her body swaying unnaturally, blood dripping from her hands. Her eyes glowed in the darkness, and she took a step toward me. I didn't wait. I bolted toward the car, my legs moving on pure instinct. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably, but finally I found the unlock button. The doors clicked open, and I threw myself into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut behind me. With trembling hands, I jammed the key into the ignition and started the car. The engine roared to life, and I threw the car into reverse, my heart pounding as I backed out of the parking space. I looked over my shoulder just in time to see Laura standing there watching me. Her face was twisted into a grotesque smile, her eyes burning with rage. I didn't wait to see what she would do next. I hit the gas, speeding down the narrow road that led out of the park. The trees blurred past me, the headlights illuminating the winding path ahead. As I drove, I couldn't stop shaking. My mind was racing, replaying the events of the night over and over again. Haley, Mel, Georgia, all of them were gone. And Laura. Laura was still out there. Eventually, I saw the soft glow of lights in the distance. A diner. I pulled into the parking lot, my hands trembling as I parked the car. I stumbled inside, my legs barely able to support me, and the staff immediately called the police. It's been a few days since that night. The police retrieved the bodies of my friends, but Laura's remains elusive. Despite their best efforts, they haven't found her, or whatever she's become. I can't stop crying. The guilt of surviving while my friends didn't is unbearable. Every time I close my eyes, I see them. Their faces, their lifeless bodies, and I hear Laura's twisted snarl echoing in my ears. I haven't slept since that night. I can't. Because every time I doze off, I see her, standing at the edge of the forest, watching me, waiting. A strange new beginning. I've been the director of a psychiatric hospital for exactly 1 day, and already I feel like I've stepped into a living nightmare. When I took the job, I was desperate. After months of fruitless interviews and rejections, I was thrilled when the state's Department of Health and Welfare offered me this position. The interview had been blunt, to say the least. The state official told me, straight-faced, that I was only being offered the job because no one else wanted it. "You're the only applicant who meets the minimum requirements," he said, his tone flat. For anyone else, that would have been a punch to the gut. For me, it was a relief. Finally, someone was offering me something. But as I sit in my office now, on my first day, I'm starting to understand why no one else wanted this job. The moment I arrived at the facility, things felt off. The security was tighter than I expected. I was immediately made to hand over my phone and any other communication devices. When I asked why, one of the guards pointed to a sign that read, "This is a closed facility. No outside communication devices allowed." I felt uneasy, but I complied, trying not to let it bother me. After all, security in a psychiatric facility is standard procedure, right? As I walked into the building, I was greeted not by a fellow director or even a nurse, but by the janitor. He was an older man, probably in his late 50s, with hands that trembled visibly, like someone in the early stages of Parkinson's. He didn't offer a smile or a warm welcome. Instead, he muttered under his breath, "I'll show you to your office." His tone was one of annoyance, as if I had interrupted something important. As we walked down the halls, I started to take in my surroundings, and it wasn't pretty. The building was crumbling, filthy, and had an overpowering stench. Open trash cans overflowed with garbage, and I saw rats feasting on the leftovers. The patients seemed neglected, their clothes dirty, their hair matted. Some wandered aimlessly, while others sat in corners, muttering to themselves. I saw one man squatting in a hallway, casually defecating right in the middle of the floor. No one batted an eye, not even the staff. But the strangest part was the way everyone was looking at me, staff and patients alike. It wasn't curiosity in their eyes, but something darker. Hatred, distrust. It was like I had invaded their territory and they resented me for it. One man in particular stood out from the rest. He was older, maybe in his 70s, wearing a torn hospital gown that looked like it hadn't been washed in months. His grey hair hung limply around his wrinkled face, and his eyes bore into me with a cold, piercing stare. I tried to avoid his gaze, but I could feel his eyes following me, burning into the back of my head as I walked past. The office and the note. After what felt like an eternity, we reached my office. The janitor fumbled with his keys, finally opening the door and grunting a quick, Yeah, as I thanked him. He shuffled away, his jangling keys fading as he disappeared down the hall. The office was bare, just an old, outdated computer, a landline phone, and a desk covered in dust. File cabinets lined the walls, but they looked like they hadn't been touched in years. On the desk was a single sheet of paper with the heading, "Must read, important information regarding several patients at the facility." My predecessor, Dr. Richardson, had left me a note, and I was grateful for the guidance. I figured it would give me a better understanding of the patients, maybe help me settle in. But as I began to read, my unease grew. The The note detailed basic facility rules, but more importantly, it gave warnings about several specific patients. Their files were heavily redacted, but the note filled in some gaps, at least the most crucial ones. Patient 106 suffers from extreme schizophrenia, the note read. Do not assume she can be transferred to a less secure wing simply because she appears to be improving. She is crafty and will harm herself or others if given the chance. I pulled out her file, curious to see if the information matched. Sure enough, the file described a 42-year-old woman with black hair, standing at 5'1". But beyond that, almost everything else had been blacked out, as though the state didn't want me or anyone else to know too much. Then there was patient 143. Patient 143 is in a near-constant state of catatonia, the note warned, with emphasis on the near. He will snap out of it if you give him your back. Do not let him sneak up behind you. I shuddered, picturing this man standing silently behind someone, ready to strike. Again, the file offered little detail beyond a physical description. Male, 28 years old, bald, with a history of violent episodes during his brief moments of lucidity. But the most disturbing part of the note was about patient 151. Unlike the others, this section was written entirely in bold, clearly marked as the most important piece of information. Patient 151 is the most dangerous in the facility, the note began. Follow these rules to the letter, or your life and the lives of others will be in danger. The rules were simple yet chilling. Avoid looking at patient 151, he doesn't like it. Do not acknowledge his presence when he creeps around you. Do not say his identification number out loud. Never, under any circumstances, mention Dr. Richardson's name around him. I couldn't help but pull out his file. What could make this patient so dangerous? But like the others, the file was mostly blacked out. All I could see was his age, 71, height, 5'3", and a brief note stating that he had a history of delirium and violent outbursts. There was a photo, a black and white image of an old man with sunken eyes and a sad expression. The longer I stared at the picture, the more unsettled I felt. His eyes seemed to draw me in, like they were telling me something, but I didn't know what. The encounter with 151. That's when I heard it, the soft shuffle of feet in the hallway. I looked up, and there he was. Patient 151. The same man from the photo, but different. His eyes weren't sad like in the picture. They were enormous, bulging out of his skull as if they could barely fit in their sockets. His mouth stretched unnaturally wide, like it had been pulled apart at the edges. I froze, remembering the note's first rule. Avoid looking at 151. He doesn't like it. But it was too late. I had already made eye contact, and I could feel the change in him. His expression darkened, and he let out a high-pitched, blood-curdling screech that made my ears ring. Slowly, he started moving toward me, his steps awkward and jerky, until his thighs were pressed against the edge of my desk. In one swift motion, he leapt onto my desk, crouching like an animal, his eyes inches from mine. I was frozen, terrified. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. I heard footsteps coming down the hall, and patient 151 disappeared into the shadows. A nurse entered my office, startling me. "Sorry, Dr. Clarence," she said, a nervous smile on her face. Her name tag read Jenny. "I didn't mean to scare you." I quickly stuffed the note and the file into my desk drawer, not wanting anyone to see what I had just read. "No problem, Nurse Jenny," I said, trying to compose myself. Jenny offered to give me a tour of the facility, and I agreed, hoping it would help me get my bearings. The tour, a house of horrors. The tour didn't do much to ease my mind. If anything, it confirmed my worst fears. The facility was in even worse shape than I had realized. Jenny led me to the common area, where patients interacted when they weren't confined to their rooms. As soon as we walked in, the room fell silent. The patients stopped whatever they were doing and stared at me. It was as if my presence had sucked all the air out of the room. One patient, the same man from earlier, patient 151, was banging his head against the wall. Each time his skull made contact, a sickening thud echoed through the room. I could see blood trickling down his forehead, but he didn't seem to notice. His back stiffened, and he turned to face me, blood streaming from the wound on his head. I quickly looked away, remembering the warning. Avoid looking at 151. We continued the tour, and Jenny showed me the rooms of patients 106 and 143. Patient 106, the woman with schizophrenia, sat in a straitjacket in the middle of her padded cell, her eyes glazed over. She looked much younger than 42, more like someone in their late 20s, and her hair wasn't as dark as the file had suggested. She opened her mouth to speak, but all that came out was a stream of drool. Jenny mentioned it was almost time for her medication. Patient 143 was even more unsettling. He sat motionless in his cell, staring blankly at the wall. His file had described him as catatonic, and he certainly looked the part. His eyes were wide open, his mouth slightly agape, and he didn't move a muscle. However, I couldn't help but notice that he had more hair than I'd expected from the file, which had described him as bald. Jenny must have seen my confusion because she quickly explained, "We shave his head regularly. There was an incident involving his hair a few months ago. It's just safer this way." As she spoke, I noticed her eyes kept darting to the ceiling, a nervous habit she'd displayed a few times now. It reminded me of something, a telltale sign I'd seen before in patients who were hiding something. Was she lying to me? I didn't push it, but a knot of suspicion was tightening in my gut. The rest of the tour didn't change my mind about the place. It was clear the facility was in shambles both physically and operationally. When I asked Jenny about staffing, she admitted, "There are only about 7 of us right now, including the janitor and Clevis, the security guard. We've been working overtime to keep up." 7 staff members for what seemed like dozens of patients. No wonder everything was falling apart. But the way she said it, the way her eyes kept glancing upward, there was something she wasn't telling me. Maybe it was just the strain of working in such a run-down place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was going on here. As we made our way back to the entrance of Wing 3, where the most dangerous patients were kept, I saw patient 151 again. This time, he was walking slowly down the hallway, his bare feet slapping against the floor. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to keep my eyes down, not wanting to break any of the rules Dr. Richardson had laid out in his note. Even from the corner of my eye, I could see the strange way 151 moved, almost like his body didn't fit right, like his limbs were too long, his joints too loose. I could feel Nurse Jenny's unease as 151 passed us by. She itched her arm, the nervous twitch more pronounced than before. For a moment, I thought she might say something, but instead, she turned away, quickening her pace as we left the hallway behind. The revelation. After the tour, I went back to my office, my mind racing. Something was very wrong here, and it wasn't just the crumbling building or the understaffed facility. There was something off about the people, both the patients and the staff. I sat down at my desk and reached into the drawer to retrieve the note and patient 151's file, but my hand came up empty. The note and the file were gone. I searched frantically, pulling open every drawer, checking the cabinets, even lifting the old, dusty computer monitor to see if they had slipped behind it. But there was nothing. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. Suddenly there was a knock, not on the door but on the wall next to it. 3 slow, deliberate bangs. My heart leapt into my throat, and for a moment I was paralyzed. The sound came again, louder this time. I forced myself to my feet and approached the door cautiously. "Hello, is anyone there?" I called out, but no one responded. I gripped the door handle, took a deep breath, and opened it just a crack, peering into the hallway. At first there was nothing. Then, down the long, dimly lit corridor, I saw the janitor. He was mopping the floor, but something was terribly wrong. He wasn't using the mop head. He was mopping with the handle, dragging the dry stick across the floor in slow, rhythmic strokes. His hands trembled more violently than before, but he didn't seem to notice. The jangling of his keys echoed through the hallway, a constant, unnerving sound. Before I could say anything, Nurse Jenny appeared at the far end of the hall. She walked up to the janitor and whispered something in his ear. The 2 of them turned to look at me, their faces twisted in expressions of pure loathing. Gone was the polite, nervous nurse who had given me the tour. Now she looked at me with disgust, her lips curled in a sneer. Without saying a word, they turned and walked down a dark corridor, disappearing from view. I stood frozen for a moment, my mind racing. What the hell was happening? Why did they look at me like that? That's when the lights began to flicker. One by one, the overhead bulbs started buzzing, growing louder and louder until, crack, the first bulb exploded, sending shards of glass raining down onto the floor. Then another, and another. Soon, the entire hallway was plunged into darkness. I heard movement in the shadows. My heart pounded in my chest as I squinted into the gloom, trying to make out the source of the noise. That's when I saw him, Patient 151, standing under the last working light, staring straight up into the bulb. His body was twisted, his arms hanging limply at his sides. He looked even more grotesque than before, his limbs elongated, his head cocked at an unnatural angle. His body began to convulse, and I heard the sickening crack of bones snapping. His arm folded backward, collapsing in on itself as if it was being pulled into his torso. His skin rippled and stretched as something moved beneath it, crawling its way up his neck. I watched in horror as a hand, his own hand, began to emerge from his mouth, prying his jaw open wider and wider until it seemed like his entire body was turning itself inside out. The light above him flickered one last time before exploding in a shower of sparks. The hallway was plunged into total darkness, save for the red strobe lights of the fire alarms, which had been triggered by the smoke from the shattered bulbs. In the flashing lights, I could see patient 151's grotesque inverted form standing perfectly still in the middle of the corridor. Then, with a single twitch of his fingers, he began to move again. He sprinted toward me. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands trembling. I could hear the rapid thudding of his bare feet as he ran down the hallway, but then, nothing. Silence. I peered through the tiny window in my office door, expecting him to be there, but the hallway was empty. The horrible truth. Shaking, I rushed to the computer on my desk. I had to find out what was going on. I typed patient 151 into the system, but all I got was an error message. Patient 151 does not exist. What? I whispered, my voice shaky. I typed in Nurse Jenny's name next, desperate for some kind of explanation. When her file popped up on the screen, I felt the blood drain from my face. The picture in her file wasn't the woman I had met today. It was patient 106, the woman I had seen in the padded room, drugged and drooling. My stomach twisted into a knot as I realized what was happening. The patients had taken over the facility. I typed in Clevis, the security guard's name, and another patient's file appeared. Patient 143, the catatonic man. I remembered the warning from the note. Do not turn your back on him. He wasn't catatonic at all. He was pretending, just like the others. Suddenly it all made sense. The janitor, the nurse, the security guard, they were all patients, and I was trapped in a building full of psychopaths who had somehow overpowered the real staff. The real Jenny, the real Clevis. They were probably being drugged or worse, hidden away somewhere while these imposters ran the facility. I reached for the landline phone, hoping to call for help, but the line was dead. Of course it was. I was on my own. I glanced back at the computer screen, at the files of the imposters, at the redacted warnings that now seemed painfully obvious, and then I remembered what the note had said about patient 151. No matter what we try, the patient manages to escape confinement. I'm not sure how long my office door will hold. I can hear footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, moving closer. If anyone reads this, I need help. Patient 151 is out there, and so are the others. I have to get to the real staff in Wing 3 before it's too late. But if I don't make it out, someone needs to know the truth. This place is more than just broken. It's been taken over by the very people we were supposed to protect. Never in my life did I imagine having a job like this. Yet here I was. It all started when I found a job listing for a company called Bell, Home Security and Surveillance. They even offered paid training. Bills were stacking up, and I wasn't getting any job replies, so I applied. To my surprise, I received an email almost immediately telling me I got the job. No interview, I thought. Attached to the email was a document, a contract that I needed to sign. It was a non-disclosure agreement, NDA, and the email explained that to keep the job, I had to sign the contract and promise not to speak about or share any details of my training or my position. I was desperate. Bills needed to be paid, and I needed money. I signed the contract without reading all the details. I know I should have read it, but I didn't have the patience. On October the 1st, it was time for my first day. I was supposed to be there at 9 p.m. It seemed like I'd be working the night shift. I put the address into my GPS, but it didn't show up. I searched it again, and still nothing. I was about to email the company when, suddenly, my GPS refreshed on its own and started giving me directions. It was weird, but I didn't think much of it. I couldn't afford to be late on my first day, so I started my car and drove. The office was far from the city, deep in the woods. I had to take a road that turned off from the highway, crossing over a small bridge to get there. When I finally arrived, I was surprised by the building. It had an unusual shape. Unlike regular office buildings, it looked like it was tilting over, as if it was about to fall. There were no windows or doors, just clean white walls. I parked my car in the empty parking lot and got out. As I approached the building, a part of the wall slid open like a door. A man in a black tuxedo greeted me. "Mr. James Morgan, welcome to Bell. We're happy to have you." "Thank you. I'm happy to be here." I shook his hand and followed him inside. We walked down several empty hallways. There were no rooms or doors along the way, and the walls stretched so high that I couldn't even see a ceiling. After walking for a while, the man stopped at a corner and pressed his hand against the wall, which slid open to reveal a small office. The office had a desk, a computer, and 3 chairs. There were cabinets and drawers filled with papers. "Please, Mr. Morgan, have a seat," he said, gesturing to the chair in front of the desk. I sat down, and he took a seat behind the desk. "Mr. Morgan, here at Bell, Home Security and Surveillance, we take our job very seriously. We ensure the safety of our customers from all types of dangers." I nodded, listening as he continued. "Dangers come in many forms, burglary, break-ins, but we specialize in a very specific type of danger." "What kind of danger?" I asked, feeling confused. He leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, Mr. Morgan, do you believe in ghosts?" I wasn't sure how to respond. How do you answer a question like that in such an unexpected situation? I'm an open-minded person. I guess I'd believe it if I saw it. He smiled. "Do you know why the company is named Bell?" "No," I replied. "It's named after the Bell family. They were a religious family who lived in a church with a notable bell tower." He pulled out an old black and white photo from one of the cabinets and placed it on the desk. The picture showed a family from the 1800s, holding pitchforks and torches. They would ring the bell whenever there was danger, not from invading armies, but from witches. I looked at the photo, trying to process what he was saying. It sounded crazy. "That's where it all began," he said, returning the photo to the cabinet. "And we continue their legacy." "So, you're a home security company that warns people about ghosts?" I asked, bewildered. "Correct. We wait for any sign of paranormal activity. When something happens, we thoroughly investigate it using cameras, sensors, and sometimes drones. Sir," he continued, "if a dangerous entity is found, we send our clients a list of instructions, enough information so they understand what's in their home and what to do. While we guide our clients to safety, a team is sent to deal with the entity. They can either capture it, neutralize it, or eliminate it." "So you're ghost hunters?" I said, almost laughing. "We're like any other home security company, Mr. Morgan. We just handle things a little differently." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It felt unreal, like I was in some weird dream. "Okay, so what's my job here?" I asked. "You'll be part of the team that deals with these entities directly. That's where the training comes in." He stood up and motioned for me to follow him. "After you." We left the office and walked down more hallways, eventually arriving at a large garage next to a locker room. A man in a black uniform approached us. "James Morgan, I assume?" he asked, extending his hand. I shook it. "Yes, that's me." "Nice to meet you. I'm Michael Waters." He smiled and pointed to his uniform. He had a little bell pinned to his shirt, along with a name tag. "Let's get you into one of these uniforms, shall we?" he said, leading me into the locker room. I turned back for a moment, but the man in the tuxedo was gone, disappeared without a sound. Michael handed me a black uniform, pants, a shirt, a belt with some pouches, a name tag, and a little bell. "Nervous?" Michael asked. "Are we really ghost hunters, or was that guy just messing with me?" Michael chuckled. "What guy?" "The guy in the tuxedo who walked me here," I said. Michael paused, then nodded. "Ah, I see. Don't worry. Nobody else could see the woman who hired me either." He started loading equipment into a black van parked in the garage. The van had a large satellite on top and a giant yellow bell painted on its side. Michael leaned over and whispered, "I have a little theory about this place." "What's that?" I asked. "I think the company is run by ghosts." "Good ghosts hunting bad ghosts?" I asked, half joking. "Maybe. Or maybe it's something much worse," he said, his voice dropping. "Yeah, we help people, but I think it's just an act." "What do you mean?" I asked, feeling a knot form in my stomach. "Think about it," Michael said, lifting a heavy container into the van. "They need money to get all these resources, right? So they pretend to be a home security company, help some people, get good reviews, and then more people pay for their services. They pretend to be the good guys to get what they need." "So they're pretending to care about people, but they really don't?" I asked, feeling uneasy. "Exactly," Michael said, nodding. In some cases, we're even told to leave customers in danger, let them fend for themselves. Can't sell home security if all homes are safe, right? The more he talked, the more I felt like I needed to get out of there. But then Michael said something that made me freeze. "I wouldn't leave if I were you. It's too late now," he said. "What do you mean?" I asked. "I don't know what happens if you leave, but I know that everyone who quits or walks out is never seen again," Michael said, his voice serious. I stared at him. Was he threatening me? I had a good friend who worked here. He decided he'd had enough, quit, and walked out. Nobody's seen him since. He just disappeared, Michael continued. He grabbed the keys off the wall and climbed into the driver's seat of the van, nodding at me to join him. I hesitated, but finally climbed into the passenger seat. "We're in this together now, James. I've got your back if you've got mine," Michael said. I sighed, feeling trapped. Michael started the van, and we drove off into the night. The first mission. We were driving along the highway when a female voice came over the radio. "Agents Waters and Morgan, we have a possible Level 4 entity detected." "Level 4 entity?" I asked Michael. "Level 4 means it can be dealt with or handled. There are different levels," Michael explained. "Level 5 is harmless. Level 4 can be dangerous but is manageable. Level 3 requires immediate action. Level 2 has a very specific way of being dealt with. Level 1 is out of our control." "Sir, what's the most common?" I asked. "Level 4 is what we usually get," Michael replied. "I haven't seen anything above that yet." We arrived at the address, a regular suburban house. Michael parked the van in front and we both got out. He handed me an earpiece and put one in his ear as well. "That's so Sharon can communicate with us," Michael said. "Sharon?" I asked. "The woman on the radio," he explained. We were about to knock on the door when Sharon's voice came through the earpiece. "The client has vacated the premises. You may enter." Michael carefully pushed open the door and we stepped inside. The house was dark and I instinctively reached for the light switch. "Don't," Michael said, stopping me. "Turning on the lights can trigger these things. Best to leave it alone for now." He pulled a tablet out of his bag and turned it on, the blue glow providing just enough light to see what was in front of us. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Gathering information," he said, tapping on the screen. We stood there in the dark, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then Sharon's voice came through our earpieces again. "Level 4 entity detected at 10:41 p.m. Subject appears as a female, approximately 11 years old. She is currently upstairs in the first bedroom on the right." Michael nodded. "Roger that, Sharon." We made our way upstairs, the house eerily quiet. My heart pounded in my chest as we reached the top of the stairs and approached the bedroom door. Michael slowly pushed the door open and we stepped inside. What I saw next made my blood run cold. There, in the corner of the room, stood a little girl. She looked normal at first glance. Long, dark hair, wearing a simple dress, but she wasn't standing on the floor. She was standing on the ceiling. I felt a chill run down my spine. There was no way this was real, and yet there she was, defying gravity, her feet firmly planted on the ceiling. Her head was twisted at an unnatural angle, her eyes staring at us with a blank, empty expression. "Michael," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Stay calm," Michael said, his voice steady. He reached into one of the pouches on his belt and pulled out a piece of candy. He slowly approached the girl, holding the candy out in front of him. "Hey there, sweetie," Michael said gently. "Why don't you come down and have some candy? It's really good. I know you like candy." The girl's head turned, and her eyes seemed to focus on the candy. She started to move, slowly descending from the ceiling, but what happened next was something out of a nightmare. As she lowered herself, I saw red, bloody hands reaching through her feet. They gripped the ceiling as the girl's body came down, and soon I realized that there was something else using her as a shell, a hideous creature emerging from within her body. One of the hands let go of the ceiling and reached for the candy. The creature's head then began to emerge from between the girl's legs. It looked as though it had no skin, its raw, bloody form exposed. The girl's body was just a puppet, and this thing was wearing her like a costume. My stomach turned and I felt a wave of nausea. Michael remained calm, offering the candy to the creature. It snatched the candy from his hand and shoved it into its mouth. More of its body began to push through the girl's skin, like it was wearing her as some kind of grotesque outfit. The sight was too much. I couldn't handle it. I panicked. I turned and ran out of the room, rushing down the stairs as fast as I could. I heard Michael shouting behind me, "James, stop!" But it was too late. I was already at the bottom of the stairs when I heard an ear-piercing scream from behind me, followed by a loud crash. I turned just in time to see the creature coming after me, the girl's skin peeling away from its body as it moved. "Michael!" I shouted, reaching for the door. Suddenly I heard gunshots. Michael had drawn his gun and was firing at the creature. The bullets hit it, and it stumbled, crashing into the wall and collapsing onto the floor. The creature was still breathing, though it was severely wounded. Michael approached it cautiously, pressing 2 fingers against what seemed to be its neck. "Sharon, we need medical assistance," Michael said into his earpiece. I stared at him, completely bewildered. "You want to save that thing? It tried to kill me." Michael looked at me, his expression serious. "This is our job, James. We capture these things, keep them out of trouble. We don't just kill them." "You're insane," I shouted, my voice trembling. "You signed up for this, James. You put on the uniform. You're part of this now," Michael said, his eyes locking onto mine. "I'm leaving," I said, shaking my head. "I can't do this." Michael didn't move. He just looked at me, his expression unreadable. "I told you what happens if you leave." "That's just a coincidence," I said, my voice faltering. "It has to be." Michael shrugged. "If you're so sure, go ahead. Walk away." I stood there, my hand on the doorknob, my heart pounding. I wanted to leave. Every part of me was screaming to get out of there, to forget everything I had seen. But something in Michael's eyes made me hesitate. There was a seriousness, a certainty that made me doubt myself. I let go of the doorknob and stepped back, my shoulders slumping in defeat. Michael nodded. "Good choice." I hated this job. Every part of me wanted to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But Michael was right. I had signed up for this, and now I was stuck. Life at Bell. I think the reason I can get away with talking about my job is that no one would ever believe me. The story is just too absurd. Who would believe that there's a home security company secretly hunting ghosts and monsters? But it's real, and I'm still working there. The pay is more than I could have ever dreamed of. I bought my own house, got the car I always wanted. On the outside, it looks like I'm living the perfect life. But every night when I drive home after my shift, I feel that same sense of dread. I think about all the horrors I've seen, and I know that one day I might not make it out. One day we'll encounter something we can't handle, something beyond our control, and that will be the day we don't clock out. I'm writing this now because I feel like I need to tell someone, anyone, what's going on. Even if no one believes me, at least I've said it. Tonight I'm going back to work. Michael called me earlier telling me to have a nice meal and do something I enjoy before my shift. "We've survived this long, Michael. We can handle another night," I told him. Michael was quiet for a moment, then he said, "It's a level 2. My heart sank. Level 2 meant we were in for a dangerous night, something that had to be dealt with very carefully, something that could easily go wrong. I don't know what's going to happen tonight, but I hope that somehow we make it out alive." Final thoughts. If you're reading this, please take my story to heart. Be careful of the choices you make, especially when you're desperate. You never know what you might be signing up for. And if you ever come across Bell, home security and surveillance, just keep walking. Don't even think about it. Because once you're in, there's no way out. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.